Hey there, humans! Jason here, ready to tackle one of life's greatest mysteries, fish pee. Yeah, you actually heard that correct. Today, we're going to tackle a question that's been swimming around our minds for a while now. Do fish actually pee? And if so, how does it all work? So grab your scuba gear and let's get started. Along the way, we'll talk a little bit about osmosis and concentrations of salt in salt water, and we'll tackle it together. Have you ever heard of the phrase, to drink like a fish? Well, unless you're a deep sea diver, it probably means staying sober. Freshwater fish, believe it or not, don't drink, but their saltwater counterparts, well, they're constantly guzzling down the salty stuff. So what gives anyway? Do fish actually pee? What's the deal with their liquid intake and output? Water is life's elixir, essential for maintaining the delicate balance of chemistry within all living organisms that we currently know of. But for fish, staying hydrated isn't quite as simple as taking a swig from the nearest stream. You see, fish have this handy contraption called gills. Now, it allows oxygen to flow into their bodies, but here's the kicker. Gills also let water escape, kind of like having a tiny leaky faucet attached to your neck. Now here's where things get interesting. Ocean water is saltier than a salty pretzel, and that poses a bit of a problem for our aquatic friends. You see, water likes to move from areas of low concentration to high concentration, appropriately named osmosis. Now we're going to talk a whole lot more about osmosis in just a minute, but the core of what's going on with fish and their peeing or not peeing really boils down to osmosis. So, what exactly is osmosis? Well, at its core, it's the movement of solvent molecules, usually water, across a semi-permeable membrane from an area of low solute concentration to an area of high solute concentration. Now, before we go any farther, we have to talk about some of these terms. When we have anything dissolved, we have what we call a solution. That is the entire thing. The water plus the salt dissolves. That's called a solution. Now, the solvent is the water itself in pure form without anything dissolved in it. That's called the solvent. What we put inside of the water, usually salt, but it could be sugar or anything that dissolves, that's called the solute. So keep those terms in mind as we talk about fish pee and osmosis. The solvent is what we're putting stuff into. The solute is what we're dropping inside to dissolve. And once it's all dissolved, we call that thing a solution. But hold on a second, we haven't talked about this thing called a semi-permeable membrane. What is that? It's a membrane that is permeable to the solvent, but not the solute. Think of it as kind of like a microscopic greeter at a restaurant. It only allows certain molecules to pass through while kicking the others to the curb. Now, obviously, we're talking about fish in this whole thing here, but you need to think more broadly than that. Every cell in your body has a cell membrane. So that's a semi-permeable membrane. The purpose of the cell membrane is to contain the cell parts on the inside and everything else on the outside. But as you know from biology, things are constantly passing through the membrane in one direction or another, but obviously it's selective in what it allows to pass through. So that's really what a semi-permeable membrane is. In this case, when we have a semi-permeable membrane talking about salt water, what it does is it blocks the salt, the sodium ions and the chlorine ions from going through the membrane, but it allows the water to pass through. Remember, salt is sodium chloride. Sodium is a metal from the left-hand side of the periodic table. Chlorine is a gas, normally on the right-hand side of the periodic table, but when they join together, they form sodium chloride. Now, when we put sodium chloride in water, the water molecules are able to rip apart the sodium bonded to the chlorine there and basically pull them apart physically. So what you have is sodium charged ions floating around solution, and you have chlorine charged ions floating around the solution as well. The reason they're charged is because chlorine likes to attract extra electrons, whereas sodium really likes to give up an extra electron from its outer valence shell there, and that's why sodium and chlorine like to bond in the first place. Now remember, sodium is a metal from the left-hand side of the periodic table. In general, metals like to lose electrons when they form chemical bonds. Now, chlorine usually is a gas on the right-hand side of the periodic table, and in general, chlorine likes to gain electrons when it bonds with things. So sodium likes to lose electrons, chlorine likes to gain electrons. These guys are going to be friends. And so they bond together, and it forms sodium chloride, which is a crystal, and that's what we call table salt. Now, when we put this sodium chloride, we call that a solute, right? Because it's going into a solvent to form a solution. When we put it into the water molecules are also charged because water is polar. And they're pulling on the sodium and the chlorine that are bonded together, and they're able to physically rip them apart. So what you have, when you see the salt slowly disappear and go into solution, what's really happening at the microscopic level is the sodium and the chlorine, which are bonded, are being ripped apart into smaller and smaller pieces. So you have sodium ions floating around solution, and you have chlorine ions also floating around the solution. The reason they're ions is because I just told you sodium wants to lose electrons, so it's a positively charged sodium ion. Chlorine likes to gain electrons, so it's a negatively charged chlorine ion, and these are floating around in solution in between the water molecules. So once salt is dissolved in solution, you see the water molecules that are already there, but in between the water molecules are these sodium and chlorine ions. Now, the semi-permeable membrane prevents the sodium or the chlorine from moving through the membrane, but the water is free to move back and forth across the membrane. This is a similar thing that's going on in your cells, allowing certain things to cross the membrane while keeping parts of the cell structure contained inside. To visualize it a little better, picture this. You've got a container divided into two compartments by a semi-permeable membrane. In one compartment, you've got pure water, while in the other compartment, you have a solution with a high concentration of solute molecules like salt, basically salty water on the other side. Now, here's where the magic happens. The water molecules, being the sneaky little ninjas that they are, they start to shimmy their way through the membrane in an attempt to balance out the solute concentration on both sides. Now, this process is called osmosis, and it continues until equilibrium is reached on both sides of the membrane, with the concentration of solute molecules being the same on both sides. It's kind of like a high-stakes game of tug of war, with water molecules playing the role of the rope. If you remember only one thing from this, remember this. The water is the only thing that can flow through the membrane, and it likes to travel through the membrane in such a way so the solution concentration on both sides becomes equal. That's what I mean by equilibrium. So in general, it likes to flow from an area of low concentration on one side of the membrane to high concentration on the other side. Because if the water flows from low concentration of salt to high concentration of salt, if water flows in that direction, then you're diluting the salty side, bringing things back into equilibrium. For instance, imagine you have a cup containing 100 milliliters of water into which you introduce 15 grams of sugar. Let's use sugar instead of salt. Upon dissolving, the sugar blends in with the water between the water molecules, forming a solution where the sugar acts as the solute and the water is what we call the solvent. Now, envision a second cup, also containing 100 milliliters of water, but this time with 45 grams of table sugar added. So in this case, the sugar dissolves just like before, creating another mixture, another solution. However, these two now hold solutions with different concentrations. When we compare the solutions of unequal solute concentration, the one with the higher solute concentration is what we call hypertonic. Think of hyper being high, hypertonic. While the one with the lower concentration we call hypotonic, hypotonic. Now, if both solutions in both cups contain identical solute concentrations, then we call it isotonic. Now I want you to envision combining these two solutions into a beaker, but the beaker is separated by a semi-permeable membrane. This means the sugar cannot flow across, only the water. Now the membrane features pores that are too small for these sugar molecules to go through, but large enough to let the water molecules pass across. Now on one side of the membrane lies the hypertonic solution, that's the high concentration, while the other side of the membrane contains the hypotonic solution with the lower concentration. Now remember, in the hypertonic solution with a lot of salt, there's actually less water over there. So that sets up a concentration gradient across the membrane. So then the water migrates from one side of the other in such a way so eventually both sides are what we call isotonic, which means they have the same concentration of dissolved substances on both sides. So we said in osmosis that if we have a semi-permeable membrane, the water is going to flow from the side with a low concentration over to the side with high concentration. Why is that? It seems like it's a little bit backwards. Why does it go that way and not the other way? Well, think about it. If my hand is a semi-permeable membrane, okay, and on this side over here is a very high concentration of salt in the solution, and on the other side is a much lower concentration of salt, or maybe even no salt, just pure water over here. What's going to happen? Well, on this side, I have lots of salt taking up space along with the water. The salt can't do anything. It can't go anywhere. But the water is trying to flow back and forth through the pores in the semi-permeable membrane. You can think of the water molecules here having kind of a water pressure against the semi-permeable membrane. But when you look at both sides, since there's more salt over here, there has to be less water molecules compared to the other side with no salt at all. Since there's less water molecules, there's less pressure. So we call it kind of a kinetic pressure or an osmotic pressure, right? And so that's the pressure of the water trying to go through from this side to the other side. But over here, there's much less salt, or maybe even no salt. So there's a much high pressure of water trying to go through the membrane. So the concentration of the water tries to flow from the concentration of lower concentration to the higher concentration because there's more kinetic pressure or more osmotic pressure pushing into the membrane. And so it goes through the membrane in such a way that the water flows across and attempts to dilute the other side and eventually bring them into equilibrium with each other. Because remember, if this is high concentration of salt and this is low concentration of salt, if the water flows this way, I'm losing water, so I'm increasing the concentration over here. It's getting saltier and saltier as I'm losing water. But over here, I'm gaining water, and so it's getting less and less concentrated. So what's happening is they're coming into equilibrium, eventually reaching what we call that isotonic solution, where the concentration on both sides is the same. At least that's what it's attempting to do all the time. All right, now that we've talked about osmosis, let's put it all together. Fish cells, like all cells, have a semi-permeable membrane. That's what a cell membrane is. Eventually, the concentration of stuff on either side of the membrane will try to even out. So a fish that lives in salt water will have a somewhat saltier water inside of itself. But if you put it in fresh water, and the fresh water will, through osmosis, try to go into the fish, going from low concentration outside to higher concentration on the inside of the fish. This will cause the cells of the fish to swell, and so the fish will die. So if you take a saltwater fish and put it in a freshwater pond, it'll die because the water will flow into the cells of the fish, trying to go from low concentration outside to higher concentration on the inside through osmosis. The cells will literally swell up like balloons, and some of them will rupture, burst, and the fish will die. What do you think is going to happen if we go the opposite way? What happens if we take a freshwater fish and we put it in the ocean? Well, the freshwater fish has an inside that has water in it, but not as salty as the salt water on the outside. So you'll have a fish without very much salt inside of it and a very salty solution on the outside. So what's going to happen in this case? The water is going to try to go from low concentration inside the fish to the high concentration on the outside of the fish. So what will happen is the fish will rapidly get dehydrated. The water will flow out literally across the cell membranes through the fish into the surrounding area, and the cells inside of the fish will shrivel up. And in many cases, that causes the fish to die as well. So as you can see, osmosis plays a critical role in maintaining the delicate balance of fluids within every living organism, including humans. So we've mentioned our cells. Let's go back to that. They're like tiny little water balloons filled to the brim with a solution of ions and molecules. Osmosis helps regulate the water content within our cells, and it ensures that we don't swell up like a waterlogged sponge or shrink up and shrivel up like raisins in the sun. But osmosis just doesn't affect biological system, it's also at play in everyday chemistry experiments. So have you ever wondered why, if you take a cucumber and put it in salty water or salty brine, it becomes crisper? Well, that's osmosis. That's how we make pickles. As the water molecules move out of the cucumber cells, it causes the cucumbers to shrivel up and shrink a little bit, causes them to firm up and get crunchy. You can do the same experiment with slices of potatoes and get a similar result. And there's also something called reverse osmosis, which is a process that's used to purify water by forcing it through a semi-permeable membrane to remove impurities and contaminants. So basically, we can use osmosis in reverse to actually remove contaminants or things that are dissolved in the water. So the next time you take a sip of water or a bite into a juicy piece of fruit, remember the silent dance of the osmosis happening at the molecular level, keeping our world in perfect balance. All right, so now we want to return to the main question that we started this whole thing with. I want you to imagine a fish. Do fish actually pee? I want you to imagine sitting on the beach, chilling with a bag of chips. You've got salty snacks and a bottle of water, and you're munching away. Your cells in your body are starting to crave some water to balance the salty overload. Similarly, saltwater fish face a constant challenge of water wanting to escape their bodies due to the saltiness of the ocean. Remember, for a saltwater fish, the ocean outside is much, much saltier than the even salty insides, so water is constantly trying to leave the fish directly through their cell membranes all the time. But fear not, my fishy friends, nature always finds a way. Ocean-dwelling fish have evolved some nifty little tricks to stay hydrated and keep their electrolytes in check. One such trick involves those fancy gills of theirs. Deep inside of the gills, special cells work tirelessly to pump out the excess salt, ensuring that our underwater pals stay salty, but not too salty. Now, how does all of this relate to our original question, what about fish pee? Well, hold on to your fins because here's where it gets even more fascinating. Ocean fish produce only a tiny, minuscule amount of urine, and what little they do make is almost as salty as the water in which they swim. Now, you could call that extreme recycling. So the bottom line is saltwater fish don't pee very much. They do pee a little, but not very much because they are always expressing water through their cell membranes all the time into the environment. They don't need to urinate very much because they're effectively losing water from the inside environment to the really salty outside environment all the time through their cell membranes. But what about freshwater fish? They've got their own set of challenges. You see, freshwater fish live in a world where their insides are saltier than the surrounding environment. And that means that the water is constantly trying to sneak into their body like a stealthy intruder in the dead of night. To combat this influx of water, freshwater fish have evolved to be professional peers, so to speak. They're practically urinating machines, releasing copious amounts of pee to keep their cells from bursting like an overinflated balloon. If any of us peed as much as a fish, we'd be going to the bathroom constantly. But here's the kicker. Fish pee isn't just waste, it's a valuable resource for aquatic ecosystems. Fish urine contains nutrients like ammonia, phosphorus, and others which acts as sort of like a natural fertilizer for algae and coral reefs, keeping the underwater world thriving and healthy. So to summarize, a saltwater fish in the ocean doesn't pee very much. Why? Because the outside ocean is extremely salty, the inside of the fish is a little bit salty, and what's going on is the water inside the fish is always trying to leave, going to the higher concentration of salt on the outside through osmosis. It's kind of always peeing directly through its cell membranes. It does pee a little bit, but not much because it's always losing water. Now contrast that with a freshwater fish in a freshwater lake. The inside of the fish is a little bit saltier naturally, just like our bodies on the inside. The outside water almost has no salt at all. So what's going to happen in that case due to osmosis is the water is going to try to go from low concentration to high concentration inside the fish. Water's always trying to go inside through the cell membranes from osmosis directly into the cell bodies of the fish. And so because of that, the fish that live in freshwater have to pee and urinate constantly to get rid of all of this extra water coming in. Otherwise, their cells will swell up and could rupture and kill them. So freshwater fish pee all the time, whereas saltwater fish pee a little bit, but not so much. But wait, there's more. Some fish take the saltwater balancing act to a whole nother level. Have you ever heard of a bull shark? Well, these bad boys can actually thrive in saltwater and in freshwater environments thanks to their incredible adaptability. Now, they need some special tricks to be able to do this because the osmosis happening is very different in both of these environments. And let's of course not forget about our other finned friends, the ocean-dwelling sharks. Now these oceanic predators have a unique way of keeping their salt levels in check. By stuffing their tissues with something called urea, a nitrogen-containing compound, sharks are able to prevent water from rushing out of their bodies, kind of like plugging a leak with a little bit of chewing gum. But beware, my land-dwelling companions, for shark meat comes with a distinctive odor reminiscent of, well, it kind of smells a little bit like pee. Thankfully, us humans don't employ such smelly tactics to regulate our water and salt levels. Can you imagine walking around smelling like a fish market all the time? So there you have it, folks. Fish pee may not be the most glamorous topic of conversation, but it's a vital component of the intricate dance of life beneath the waves. From oceanic urinators to freshwater pee machines, fish play a crucial role in maintaining the health and balance of aquatic ecosystems. And I'd like to take a second to thank you for joining me on this deep sea adventure into the world of fish pee. Until next time, keep swimming, keep peeing, and remember, always stay curious. Learn anything at mathandscience.com.